Hi gang, guess what? Another tutorial here for us. I realized that we missed quite a few classes, and a lot of information has been piling up. So what I want to call tonight's tutorial is how to, or making sense out of this mess. Ooh, mess. There we go, I can spell. Alright, and what we're talking about is essentially a mess of information. A mess of information. Okay. And I got this idea from a really neat book I read recently, How to Make Sense Out of Any Mess. Really the first step that Abby Covert goes over in this book is to shine a light on the mess. Shine a light on the mess. So that's what I'm going to do briefly with this tutorial, and you can come back to it. I'm hoping that it's going to be very useful in organizing the information that we've gone over in the syllabus. We've gone over, or, you know, we're responsible for, essentially, let's take a look here, for a few weeks of information. We're responsible for essentially week 1, week 2, where class was canceled. Week 3, where class was canceled because of NASP. And I haven't really given you any much content guidance in that area. And number 3, the class for tonight. So we essentially have 3 classes. What that's going to cover, essentially, are these topics from aptitude to achievement testing, essentially evidence-based practice. What I really want to talk about are not just evidence-based practice, but database decision-making. I want to also talk about federal and state laws, policies, and practices, and then this issue of identifying, evaluating, and using achievement tests. Psychometric considerations, okay, so lots of stuff there. Let's pick it apart, okay, that's what Abby Covert talks about in her book, is really picking it apart. So I'm going to start by talking about essentially three areas. One that we would call data-based decision-making. And then there's sort of 3 areas related. I'd say, well, let's say 2 areas related to this. Types of decisions and evidence base for the assessments that we're using. So evidence for these kinds of decisions. And then essentially I would say, you know, Salvia talked about 5 types of decisions. I'm sorry, Salvia talked about 7 types of decisions. He talked about, let me pause and get over to Salvia here. Alright, so I found Salvia, and from chapter 2, he talks about 7 educational decisions. Okay, so the first one being screening, progress monitoring, instructional planning and modification decisions, resource allocation, and you can read all these right here. Okay. Program evaluation is its own very special decision. Not typically the kinds of decisions that you're going to be making as practitioners, not simply through an assessment course like this. Okay, you're going to need to take a course on program evaluation, which I'm pretty sure we offer here. So let's talk about accountability and eligibility decisions as being the same type of decision. We can talk about resource allocation decisions as being related to all 3 of these decisions: screening, progress monitoring, and instructional planning and modification, or what I would call diagnostic decisions. Now we make these three kinds of decisions to figure out what resources to allocate if a student isn't making progress. Then we say, what does this student need additionally? With regard to screening, we start at the beginning of the year, right? And we say, well, before these students even start school, let's take a look at them with a screening instrument and use that information to allocate resources, right? Maybe assign students to different levels of instructional support. All right. So these are generally the overview that we want to kind of stick with. But I'm going to go back here and really talk about, let's say, two branches of decisions. One branch would be instructionally relevant, and the other branch would be sort of instructionally irrelevant. It happened as a function of, I guess, failure of instruction to occur. So instructionally relevant decisions are screening, progress monitoring, and diagnosis, or instructional planning. Okay, that's what John Haas called it. And then irrelevant decisions are, they're not irrelevant decisions, they're important, critically important, high-stakes decisions. But instructionally irrelevant decisions, eligibility for special education or other special programs, and then other types of accountability decisions. Now, accountability decisions and high-stakes decisions, let's say high-stakes decisions related to end-of-grade tests like the MCAS, are ethically important, okay, because schools have to be accountable to society. Schools are charged with upholding the public's trust, and it's not clear if the schools are doing that on a year-to-year, month-to-month basis. So these sort of high-stakes tests that are criticized often are critically important for maintaining the public trust. There's other issues related to that, but what we're really going to focus on in this course are these instructionally relevant decisions. Okay, so we have this one area, database decision making. Well, now we have this other area that we might, let's call that law, policy, and practice. Law, policy, and practice. It's not a really good W. Oh, that looks like the little psi. So law, policy, and practice. Okay, so I want to talk about different levels here. Okay, so really, let's talk about four different levels. Let's just talk about 4 different levels. Okay, let's talk about federal law, federal policy, not necessarily federal practices. Let's talk about state law, policy. Let's talk about local. Okay, so we're talking about school districts, laws, and policies. Not necessarily laws, now we're talking about policies and practices. We're talking about schools. Okay, so we can make some distinctions. And then we want to talk about a very important area, professional, or the profession, as a source of policy, practice. Not law necessarily, okay, but profession is a key source of ethics. So I would have to say that I should say this now and then say it again and again, that this notion of what the profession says we should do with regard to best practices, I think it's 5, you guys have that $1 million volume there. Really the notion of what the profession prescribes as practice is what we should be doing. And there are statements of principles of professional ethics that we'll talk about, how we go about making decisions, how we make those kinds of decisions, all right? So the next piece as the background for this class is related to psychometrics, okay? So we have this other area, the psychometrics area, with regard to understanding the tests themselves or the test instruments themselves. Let's undo that. Psychometrics. Now, with regard to psychometrics, we should think about a couple of things. As it said on the course schedule, you can see this over here. This is the sort of the class on psychometrics, today's class, or the class on the 25th. We talk about identifying, evaluating, and using achievement tests. Well, we're not really going to be talking about using achievement tests, but with regard to the use of achievement tests, the question becomes, does the psychometric properties of the test support their use for the kinds of decisions that we want to make? So let's think about things like test scores, let's think about concepts like validity, reliability. Probably the most important psychometric consideration would have to be, in my estimation, reliability. Absolutely, absolutely. Because, you know, as you heard before, there is no validity without reliability. And then test scores, validity, reliability, but then locating. Locating tests. And not only that, locating technical data or psychometric data. Alright, so lots of considerations to think about. Locating psychometric data that would tell us about, essentially tell us about best practices. Okay, so there are some best practices texts that I've assigned, HOSP 2012 being one of them, so that can be an important guideline. That was in the readings for, I think it was the first week. Yeah, it was the first week. John really gave an alternative and talked about instructionally useful tests, or instructionally useful achievement tests, okay? So with psychometrics, boy, we have a lot of pieces here. I'm going to circle the pieces. Let me go back and maybe uncircle the reliability piece so as to make it clear on which one of these issues, which issues we want to kind of put together here. All right, so I guess what I mean by that is, I'll show you. Here we go. Let's do, I don't know, purple. So let's circle screening, progress monitoring, diagnosis, eligibility decisions. Okay, we're not going to pay attention to these accountability decisions. High stakes assessment is really your involvement in high stakes assessment. I wouldn't say is really pertinent to this course. This course will help you, and Terry's course as well, helped you understand how to interpret tests, helped you develop what I would call assessment literacy. Okay, you won't be administering high stakes accountability tests, sort of state accountability test, right? But you will be administering accountability tests like the WJ3. Okay, we're going to learn that in this class. So accountability, you might think of state tests, and then accountability tests like the Wechsler tests, Wechsler individual achievement tests, or the WJ tests. Okay, we have the three. We're waiting for the new updated version of that achievement test. Okay, so yeah, there are some pretty high stakes. You might want to call that accountability or high stakes. Okay, so that's this piece here, relevant, irrelevant, are eligibility decisions, accountability, or high stakes decisions. Okay, not directly relevant to the instructional, day-to-day instructional process is what I mean. Okay, so let's just pay attention to the purple boxes, circles here. Okay, so now we'll talk about federal, state, local, and professional practices, policies, and laws that pertain to these kinds of decisions, right? So here's an example. What is a federal law that talks about eligibility decisions? And not only what is that law, but what does that law say about eligibility decisions? Glendina's response on the class questions and answer spoke to this, about not using just one type of test during a high stakes eligibility decision, right? So there's an example. What does the state law say? Well, usually the state law falls into line with federal law, especially if the state's receiving federal monies. Okay, so we can sort of put these together under laws and policies. So we could say, what do federal and state laws and policies tell us about eligibility decisions, about progress monitoring decisions, about diagnostic or instructionally relevant decisions, and then about screening decisions? Okay, what do laws say about that? Then the question becomes, we do this all over again with regard to local policies. What are local school policies, practices, knowledge even, teachers' knowledge related to eligibility decisions, progress monitoring decisions, screening decisions, diagnostic decisions, okay? What do the schools tell you are key policies? And then what does the profession say? Okay, I'm going to tell you this again, that the profession is the trump card, okay? You are required to practice, not only aligned with state policies relating to licensing a school psychologist for practice in the schools. Those are Department of Education policies. Then you have to pay attention, obviously, to local policies. Well, our professional, especially NASP, we're going to talk about National Association of School Psychologists, have worked to align themselves with many local, state, and federal laws and policies. Okay, so these professional practices, especially professional ethics, trump, to a large extent, local, federal, and state laws and practices. Not laws, okay? Practices and policies, okay? So what we're seeing, here's an example in North Carolina. Okay, so here's an example. North Carolina has recently written into law, they have outlawed the discrepancy formula. So the discrepancy between IQ and achievement is no more in North Carolina. Okay, so ethical standards related to using response to intervention to assess students using an RTI framework or using progress monitoring assessments to examine the student's responsiveness to instruction, that's the way to go in North Carolina. And they're more aligned with these kinds of contemporary professional ethics. So you really need to know your professional ethics and practice with regard to those professional ethics. Now, let's get down to psychometrics. Boy, we have a real mess up here. So let me pause and I'm going to erase a little bit of this. All right, so having cleaned up shop a little bit, let's move down to the third piece here, which is psychometrics. Okay, so let's use law, policy, and practice as sort of the nexus for connecting psychometrics with the different decisions. We could do that, or what we could do is essentially make a direct connection. So let's go back up here, use purple again to make some connections. So test scores, for example. What test scores would we be using to diagnose instruction for students? Would we be using standard scores? Right? Or are standard scores these broad-based norm reference scores that are more helpful for screening decisions. Okay. Are standard scores sensitive to small changes that students make in learning on a week-to-week basis? If not, then we can't use standard scores for progress monitoring. Okay, can't do that. So these are some considerations when we're making connections between these different pieces. What best practices say? Okay, oops, what happened there? I don't know why this is stuck doing that. There we go. So really, what do best practices say about the use of test scores? Yikes. What is happening? Pause. Alright, I got a grip on things. So where we left off, essentially, what does the profession say about the kinds of test scores, okay, that should be used in diagnostic decisions? What do federal and state sources tell us about the kind of test scores that should be used in diagnostic decisions? Right? Such important connections here. Okay, so do we understand test scores enough to be able to interpret federal and state laws, policies, and practices, and to understand what our professional ethics tell us to do? So with regard to psychometrics, now we get into sort of the nitty-gritty here. What do we mean when we say validity? What kind of validities are there, right? What do we mean when we say reliability? What kinds of different reliabilities are there? And where do we find tests? Not only where do we find tests, but where do we find data on tests, whether or not the tests that our districts are using or we might want to recommend are good, right? We would do that by using some websites. One of the more common websites being used today is intensiveintervention.org. www.intensiveintervention.org helps us do this. All right. So this sort of tutorial, or this little lesson, was about trying to understand not only the pieces that define the different topics. Let me just get rid of some of these for a second before I sum up the purpose here. We'll do a little more cleanup. Okay. Okay, here we are. So the purpose of tonight's class was about connecting the dots, or categorizing is a better way to say that. Categorizing many different, I guess you would say, details or small specific ideas, terms or concepts that we're learning. Categorizing, for example, screening, progress monitoring, diagnostics into decision making. Okay, and then this notion of evidence-based decision making. Our question with evidence-based is, what is that? What is evidence-based? Okay, so all of these pieces go together under this broad-based aspect of database decision making. So by categorizing those, we have a better sense of how these pieces go together in and of themselves, and we've sort of elaborated. But we've also been able to make some connections with law, policy, and practice. Okay, so database decision making, really week 1, week 2, we talked about database decision making, or the book, the readings focused on database decision making. And then we're now into psychometric content. Okay, test scores, validity, reliability, and locating tests. How do we find them, and then how do we evaluate tests? That's actually another area. That was chapter 10, evaluating tests. Is this a good test or isn't it? So this brief tutorial really just went over making some connections among major topics that will show themselves on the exam, and they're really part of the first unit in class. which is the background for all of the different kinds of tests that we're going to learn. All right, so there you have it. I hope that this brief lesson was somewhat helpful in figuring out the many different working parts that are categorized under these larger concepts. And I hope it was also useful in providing some examples and elaborating on how these different pieces connect. One of the ways to, when I do this right before we end, let me find a new board. Let's do this. I'm going to pause for just a second. All right, so I'm back. I'm going to do a little more drawing here. I'm going to do some freehand drawing. And what I want to do is sort of put psychometrics and database decision making together in, I guess we would say, let's do a 3x4 matrix here. Okay, I'm going to choose those that are most important to us. So let's do a 3x4 matrix where these issues represent test scores, reliability, and validity. And then we have 3 different kinds of decisions. Let's talk about screening decisions as the first. Okay. Screening decisions, progress decisions, and diagnostic or instructional decisions. What to do with the data once we have it. Okay. So what would go here, right? What kinds of scores are used for making diagnostic decisions? What scores are used for making progress decisions? What scores are used for making screening decisions? Okay. What are some standards of reliability that are necessary for diagnostic decisions? That would go here. Standards of evidence necessary with regard to reliability for progress decisions. What about screening decisions? Okay. Or the tests that are being used for progress. What kinds of reliabilities do they need to have? Same thing with validity. What needs to go on? Do we need to have super reliable tests or valid tests for diagnostic, progress, and screening decisions? Well, the answer there is obviously yes. Okay, so that puts together early content, data-based decision-making, or data-driven decision-making. You might have all heard that. Data-driven decision-making, or D cubed 3. D cubed M, data-based decision-making. And then psychometrics. So 2 subject matters. Bring us back to the purple. Oh goodness. It's doing this again. Okay, database decision making, psychometrics, these are class topics. And now let's go and talk about the different layers of professional practice. Okay, so now we do have to absolutely go back. I'm going to do some 3D drawing here. Bear with me for just a moment. Now we know what will come in these different areas. Let's talk about state and federal laws should come first. You could even put those into the same category to make life a little bit easier. Why don't we do that? So we'll go state and federal law. Let's talk about local practices and policies, and then professional responsibilities is the best way to say that. Okay. Excuse me. Now if we do this, then we get to look at these pieces more closely and carefully to kind of pick them apart. All right. And so here's an example. State and federal law. What does state and federal law say about the validity of screening scores? What are local practices? with regard to the validity of screening scores. A question would be, are the tests that are used for screening valid? Because that's kind of what the profession says. So here we are in this matrix here. Okay. So this is a neat way of thinking about it. It seems complicated, but going back to Avi Covert's book, this is how we make sense out of this mess, okay? Because then we can put the details together into categories and start to elaborate on and give examples of what those categories mean. So I hope, again, as I said before, as I was wrapping up, I hope this little lesson was useful in putting all the pieces together into the larger concepts that we've gone over in class, or the larger topics. Those topics being database decision making, laws, policies, and practices, and this week's topic, psychometrics. All right. So sit on that for a little while. You can review this as much as you like. Good luck with